Phew, that's always my least favorite part. It's getting everything queued up. Yes, my name's Bonnie. Autobiographicacy is this great word that I may have thought of from other sources. It's almost like we're telling a biography from the perspective of charts, visualizations, and I thought it would be an interesting way to talk about Los Angeles County through stories. As a member of the National Press Club, I come to my GIS, I'm actually a data scientist, but I came through working in GIS by looking for a tool, looking for results. I work in public health, in big health systems, and I noticed that urban landscapes were very, very vital, but they were missing from the conversations that we were having. And because we're talking about LA, I have my own history with LA. My husband was a city planner in LA County for 10 years. LA was our home, county was our home for many, many years. So there's a lot of little tidbits that when I was looking through some information historically, I didn't know about. And I thought if I didn't know about it, there'd be a lot of people that might be interested as well. So I thought was interesting was that this is how efficient Los Angeles County is. They were actually up and running before they actually were granted statehood. So that's why there's no star there. They were actually up and running and their star hadn't even been, the California wasn't even a territory of the Union. And another interesting part when we're talking about land use, which are common terms among those of us who are GIS professionals, is, the Land Act of 1852, right? These were Spanish lands. These were lands, Mexican lands. They were acquired in 1852, but prior to that, these lands had different origins. And we're going to look a little bit about some of the indigenous populations and maybe what happened to them historically, not just in LA County. This happens anywhere across the United States, but there's some profound implications and some granularity that we often miss when we're talking about geospatial concepts. But I did want to tell you, I saw this tree, I don't know if it's still there, but the first palm tree in Los Angeles was brought from the desert and planted during the 1850s, and it was still there when I was still there. It's at Figueroa Boulevard, right by the Exposition Park. So that's a little bit of history. And, after 1850s, parts of the original Los Angeles County got peeled off into San Bernardino and things like that. So that's also interesting historically. And it's also a reminder that when we look at Los Angeles County, these boundaries we create, they're fictitious. So, like the forests don't stop just because you cross into another county or a state, etc. And I had to do a little homage to the earthquake because I was in some of the big ones when we lived here in 1857. Now, I wasn't at the one in 1857. And I came across a lot of these really fun, interesting maps that you can see here that are quite historical, and you can actually see how they're developed. You can see some of the allotments that have been designated. This is a very fragile map, so it doesn't really render very well on photographs, but I really needed to include them as part of the historical perspective. And now we're starting to see what looks like Los Angeles County. Los Feliz is where I used to work. So you can see these little neighborhoods that you might see that are familiar. You can also see a lack of density because we've grown into that, haven't we? And I like this back of the napkin little sketch of how we envision Los Angeles County. It looks kind of random. How about right here, Joe? How does this work for you? But I like this because it's 1850s. It's very simplistic, and you can kind of see some of the changes using your memory and then looking back. And this is me. I always like to kind of get going before I introduce who I am. I think of myself as a human geographer. I tell the stories of the land and the infrastructure and, the buildings and those features and attributes that sit above the land and how the people move in and out of those areas, in and out of those boundaries, and how the built infrastructure impacts their lives, their health outcomes specifically, but expanding that to other areas of the life. And before we get started, I like sometimes I used to teach, talk to a lot of medical audiences, and we would just stick with, works of art, because when you show people maps and charts, and you're like, well, what do you see here? And what do you think the title of this chart should be? Everyone just clams up because they don't want to feel like they don't know something. So what's interesting here is that if you use art, people are very comfortable saying, well, I don't get that. I don't get it. And they'll like reveal themselves in interesting ways. So this graphic by William Eggleston, I'll give that tell to you, has traveled around the world with me. So I hear a lot of feedback about what they think this is. If you're old enough to know what's going on in this space, a lot of you never saw a defrosting refrigerator in your life. You think it just magically happens. But also, in my defense, I never had this problem. This was something my parents had to deal with. You had to manually, for the most part, defrost these things. But looking at this image here, a lot of people come to it and they have perceptions, right? You look at it, all of you have already made a judgment about what you're looking here. The first time I saw it, I was like, well, how does this person subsist on ice cream, tater tots, and beef pie? It looked questionable. You could also have a judgment about, well, this person isn't very healthy, or this person might be elderly, or, there's a lot of judgment when we look at geometric forms. And that's a reminder for map making, map storytelling, and things we bring into the conversation as well. Somebody had thought, how would you think differently if I told you this person had been dead for 3 months and this was in the freezer? Now you're not going to judge them on like, oh, you didn't defrost your refrigerator. You get where I'm going. What this actually is a work of art by William Eggleston. It's a dye transfer technique where the colors that you see up here, like on the ice cream and on the little tater tots, these have all been enhanced. So what it actually is a photograph trying to depict the beauty in some of these geometric forms. And talking about the land grants, I wanted to kind of make the connection between the history and like my connection with LA and LA County and geospatial. This is the oldest remaining home in Los Angeles County. If we were in a room together, I would love to see, sign of hands, who's heard of this, who's tried to go see it. It's a historical landmark. But unfortunately, it's not really being maintained. But just to give a little like background to it before I show you the next slide, it was built to qualify a son of a former Spanish colonial soldier for a land grant from the Spanish crown before California even got involved. And it used to be called Rancho San Antonio, and it was 29,000 plus acres. And it included like the city here you see of Bell Gardens. It included Commerce, parts of Montebello, parts of East Los Angeles. It was a huge expanse of a land grant. And now here's what's left of it. This little, there it is, in this little trailer park here. And there is an illustrious story of how this came to be over time. But if you stood on Gage Avenue and you tried to look at this mansion, you could just see like the tower, the little rooftop. It's surrounded by this trailer park. But I thought it was really interesting because, when you tell me I can't see something, I want to see it. So, you just put in the address, bam, then you find out more of the story. And, this is actually, we're gonna look at this in QGIS, these are the highways, the LA highways are famous and infamous. And when we start looking at infrastructure, what questions are we actually asking? What are the social categories and processes at work? And we need to be asking ourselves things. So, sometimes we just ask questions like, well, where's the highway? Where's the railway? Where are the sidewalks? Where are the buildings? But what are we really asking? And so that's kind of the granularity and the awareness that we need to bring to questions that we want to address with data science, data analytics, and that extra column that we all have for the geometry. And, back to the highways and the history and the indigenous people and the land that had been part of another country. During the excavation, if you are familiar, I think ArcGIS has this really cool hub about how they decide where highways go in some of these urban communities. And some of them are built intentionally to keep others in certain locations and other people in other areas. So there really is a deterministic method in where some of these highways go. And we'll see that as we go a little further along. But this one originally cut through a cemetery, and most of the bodies had allegedly been relocated, but you see a couple guys over here didn't make the trip. So it's a very interesting history to have when you're building out an area and you have to make some of these decisions. And then, we also have parking lots, right? Think of parking lots as those impervious areas, the asphalt, where we can have urban heat islands, and we have hotter temperatures, and we don't have tree cover, and what that can bring to a community. And this is another one of those old timey photographs that I love. But unfortunately, they're standing on the grounds of Campo Santo. And this is where hundreds of indigenous Angelinos had been buried. And it was raised and, for highways, parking lots, and structures like that. So the built infrastructure often has a dark side to it, an understanding, but we can also hold it in a high regard for, what it once was, and think about it historically when we're talking about our communities. And right here, these are cemeteries too that no longer exist. The Jewish cemetery on the hillside. And this is just, putting that texture in where you're looking at the fiber of communities and of the growth of an area. And, we know these things, right? We know that, discrimination is not solely based on phenotype, but we have entrenched social and political practices at play too. And this is everywhere. This isn't just, Los Angeles County, but we need to think about these sorts of things when we're, writing policy or looking to grow areas. And this is a really interesting demographic here. What we're looking at here is the 1930s redlining all across the United States. And briefly, before we had mortgages, when you bought a house, it's like, here, let me buy a house, you pay for it within 5 years. Well, as you can imagine, that left a lot of people out of the market, right? So then the FHA comes along and they're going to lend money so more people can own homes. And the problem with that is, well, not a problem. I mean, this is just how the world works. If I'm going to give you money, I need to make risk assessments. So they went out and they went to look at the different neighborhoods to kind of figure out how they were going to give credit for these homes. And I'm kind of just summarizing it for the sake of time. But there were a lot of discriminatory practices, denying credit for disadvantage or high percentage of minority neighborhoods. And if you think about this in the modern world, and even before that, most of us are familiar with wealth transfer occurring through home ownership. If you've been decades and decades and generations out of that means of wealth transfer, you can see how you lack the inherited wealth. And this was persistent until 1968, I think, was the Fair Housing Authority. But I wanted to show you how powerful this visualization can be, because you can click on a neighborhood over here, and this is going to show you what it was like in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, this was a great neighborhood. It was a green level, and then you can look and see where it is today. So let me just make sure that I can see. Oh, you can see it. So if you look on the right, it's still green. And what you see on the right side is the social vulnerability index map. So what we're saying is locked land use systems do persist. Even though the 1930s, we're looking at over, almost 100 years ago, these types of barriers to the flow of capital have persisted all these years later. And when you scroll through and see why it was zoned a certain way, look at the language here. This character, the character of this area is indubitably affected by the proximity of the university, lending an atmosphere of intelligentsia, which is unmistakable. But it's just fun to read through all these things. And then you can go down here and you can see, if you notice things flickering on the right, what's happening here is we're looking at the social vulnerability access in different neighborhoods. In this neighborhood, it's quite low. In this low percent minority, the life expectancy is pretty high. Poverty is only 19.5%, low rates of asthma, cancers on the uptick. And you could scroll through here and it links to the 1930s redlining of neighborhoods. I'm just trying to close this out. There we go. And more transit plans. When I lived there, we didn't really have much of a transit plan beyond buses. But, it's important so that these different areas can connect for work, for travel, for all sorts of things. And what I really like to do a lot historically is do rectifying of maps. It's when you find an old historical map, you have a modern day map, and you kind of want to see, well, what do those boundaries look like and how can I move them over? And these are two sections of an area in LA County. And then, this area on the left was rectified over the one on the right. And you can kind of see where the growth was, the new roads, the new, more residential. It's a nice tool to use if you are looking at historical areas and trying to see growth. And now we're looking at population demographics. I mean, all of us, when I see this, it gives me a shiver because of COVID, but we all used to walk around Venice Boulevard, shoulder to shoulder. And I do a lot of work with census data. And what I do is I don't rely a lot on the racial categories, but this was a graphic that was generated over in QGIS that I think is really interesting. Well, no, maybe this is ArcGIS. And what we're looking at here is, the predominant category of the races of people that live in some of these areas. And you can set it at 68%, 70, 51, whatever you want to be the line that's going to flip it over and say this area is mainly an Asian population. And the interesting part about that, and really how I got into geospatial to begin with also, was as a data scientist, I was often given racial data, and I really never knew what to do with it because it's a very poor biologic proxy. It's really a political construct, and without direction on, well, how am I supposed to use this information? Those of us who rely on data, we're kind of at a loss. And what I like to remind audiences about as we start looking at the census data and we look at some of the populations of who lives here and people like this do things like that, there's no way that from race you could figure out like class, education, humor, biology. There's nothing there. You can't isolate a causal force attributed to skin color that aligns with an outcome of interest. And that's an important embodiment to take forward when you're looking at data where we're looking at different populations. And, I didn't put the code in here, but I do a lot of work also with SQL and Python. But sometimes when I'm just scanning through data, you can write a really easy SQL query to find out, where is poverty below the 200% federal poverty line. What that means is if the poverty is set at, say, 10,000, you're 200% below it if you make 20,000. And although you're not at that $10,000 level, you still would qualify more than likely for government assistance in certain categories. And I just went on here, anywhere in the data that I had for the census where more than 48% of the people living in a census tract were 200% below the poverty line. And this is just giving you information. You're familiar with the neighborhoods in the areas. So I always find it really interesting. It means to dig deeper. I mean, all of this stuff in and of itself isn't telling you anything. And here, I put this in here because I wrote a SQL query to find out, just right off the bat, all the first data we got out of the census basically was population data, right? And so I just looked for areas that maybe there weren't a lot of Hispanic Latino, but any places where there were more in the 2020 census when they were in the 2010, those are the dark red areas that you see here. And, oil fields are very big in LA County. And I like to look at neighborhoods and see what's where are people living? Are there industrial complexes? Because you'll see those rated those communities lower when I was showing you the redlining slide with the Sankey kind of style diagram. And so what do our neighborhoods look like today? So we're looking here at oil reserves, but we're also looking at residential properties, and you can just layer it and see like who's living where, proximity to what, and what that might do for a potential health risk, right? And I thought this was really interesting because this is showing us LA County and how land use has shifted over time. I believe it goes back like 2005. But look at the pink areas, which are agricultural, and the red areas are growth. They're residential growth, they're homes, they're all kinds of things. So it's really interesting over time just to see how land use has shifted. Some of them went from forest to residential, back to forest. It's just a really interesting way to look at this sort of data. And when I look at communities, I also zero in wherever I am, whatever community. This is by, I believe, poverty status as well. I don't remember the actual parameters, but we're looking at overhead electric power lines. And this is really interesting too, because you have very high voltage lines running through certain neighborhoods, and those come with potential health risks as well that should be evaluated. And I like this because it shows the highway. So now you have the highway network. You see the density of the highways. And so that's noise pollution, that's runoff from the roads. Then we also have the overhead power lines. And yeah, I've worked with health systems in different communities, not this one, where you could actually pinpoint with a lot of accuracy where the uptick in asthma, childhood asthma was going to be, just by looking at the built infrastructure and some of the impervious detriments to health that are there. And just the Enviro Atlas is really cool. I thought Californians would really like this, because look at the specificness of residential populations within 300 meters of busy roadway with less than 25% tree buffer. I mean, because tree buffers for sound, right? And for offsetting some of the gas and the pollution. But you can also go into this interactive database, and you can download this information as well and ask your own questions. But you can look at land cover near water. You can look at environments. You can look at health and economic outcomes, pollutant reduction. These are all resources and tools that I'm sure many of us are aware of. But if you're not, this is a great way to zone in on your community and see what some of those challenges are, so you can tailor legislation, policy towards some of those specific drivers of health and economic outcomes. This, I had to do the earthquakes, right? So the bigger the little black drop symbol is, the larger magnitude the earthquake. And then you could see these are the faults and the folds in the US. So you can actually see where they are where they've occurred with more frequency. And it really deserves a deeper dive than we're going to give it right here. But I just thought the type of open data available to us to answer and address questions is very powerful. And over here, this is the, I hope everyone watching knows that there is a very, very big open data portal for a lot of the city and administrative data. But this one's under construction. But right here, if we click right here, you can go right in. And, you can just do a quick search. Let's see, let's look at metro stations. How about that? And what's really cool here is it will upload eventually. And this data can also be downloaded. So if you wanted to download the data, you would just hit here and you could pick your format, and then you could pull it into whatever conversation you were having, or whatever study you're doing, and whatever it is that interests you moving forward. But I mean, by no means is that all there is there. There's a ton of stuff there. So, as we, start to close out our conversation, we have to think about structural determinants of health, right? We have to think about social justice, redlining. Maybe it's not just about profound poverty or access to healthcare. Maybe it's persistent blockade in some of these structures where we don't have influx of capital transfer, like we looked at when we were talking about the redlining. And just really quickly, I thought this was really interesting because you can see some of that infrastructure we're talking about at play. I'm just going to skip around this video. We're not going to hang out here and watch videos together. But if you look at these roadways, these are areas that a lot of us are not familiar with. We don't drive through these areas. We drive around them and through them. So I thought it was interesting, you know, different work habits here, but you know, you're actually looking at the highway area. You can see all the asphalt in these areas. You can see the built parking lots. When we turn the corner here on Imperial, you can see some of these traffic lights are out. You know, you can also see, you know, the criminal activity. These are all parts of our dynamic system that I want you to think about, because it's not just what you see and put on a map. You can see our unhoused populations. You can see, you know, these are all the things that need a closer look, that need the granularity that we can lend with our geospatial eye. When we're looking at, there's that traffic light that's out. And that could be very deleterious and unsafe, right? Here we have some green spaces. So it's really important that investments are being made in green spaces, parks, places for, you know, people to play and have recreation. But, you know, you also have the unhoused communities. You have a lot of the urban blight and the urban life that does impact the health outcomes down the road. So this is just more of the same, but, you know, there's lots of little stories to be told just by driving around in a vehicle and looking around and seeing what kind of communities are being divided by the highways and which kind of communities are like included in them. Oops, I don't know what's going on here. Okay, here we go. So whatever we're looking at a story, and I'm going to show you something in our last few minutes in QGIS where we can kind of do some of this and just introduce you to some powerful data that you might have access to. But whenever I approach a storytelling in a community where we're trying to solve intractable problems, you know, what do? What is it we need to know? What are our information stories and where are we getting them? How are we doing this? Who are you communicating with? Who's on our team? Who's part of this gathering and conversation? A lot of times, if you work, you know, in government, you have these little buckets, right? You chunk all your information into, this is where we look at education. This is where we look at the highways here. Well, how do these buckets relate? Are you making the connections between the buckets? Do these buckets even talk to each other? And do they need to? Now, I missed a slide that I want to go back to if I can find this one. So just really quick before we close out, what I really like about this slide here, and I built it out, usually this is done live, but this is Southgate in Los Angeles. And it's kind of interesting. It's about 7 or 6 miles southeast of downtown Los Angeles. I picked it from a bigger extent because I liked that you could see some green space, some urban, you could see the highways. So there's a lot of stories to be told here. And those are the kind of places I actually pick. And so I did research. I'm like, oh, what can I know about Southgate? And here was something that jumped out at me and said, well, it's not the kind of place you stop and ask for directions. I thought that was kind of an interesting descriptor. But what I wanted to show you here really quickly inside QGIS, this is data uploaded from OpenStreetMap, which you can do right here if you're familiar. This is quick OSM. You can just put in whatever you're interested in looking at. You just suppose you want a building of some type and you want to just look at buildings under construction. So I'm not going to run any of this because we're kind of running out on time. But if you zoom in the way I did and you pick like canvas extent, it'll run faster, right? Because it's not going to have to do the whole layer that you pulled in. And I just want to show you here, don't leave it at 225. You'll never get your stuff to finish. So I always put it at the maximum at 2000. And then you run the query. And then when the query is done running, it shows up over here. And when it shows up over here, you might recognize these. These are temporary layers that you can easily click on and make permanent. You just have to remember, because if you don't, and QGIS will warn you, it will boot you out and you'll lose all the stuff, all the research you did. But what I wanted to show you before we close out and turn over to questions is, you can, now I just added houses. So now we're looking at some houses that have filled in, and let's look at apartments. So now we just saw the apartments, and you can turn these things on and off. But what I thought was interesting, there's a brownfield, and brownfields are kind of interesting. There's nothing developed there yet, but it's either been the scene of maybe some toxicity, maybe there's been something's detected there where it can't be built, and usually it's being transformed. But I like to add brownfields to discussions of where people live and what these barriers might look like, because we're looking at different things that impact, walkable cities. And now if I wanted to add industrial, so here's the industrial, it looks like that's the 605 maybe, but if you see where all the industrial is located, and you start adding things. So the public transport, which we'll look at in a minute. But then a really interesting thing here is, there's other things that communities need, right? You need healthcare clinics. Well, there's two. Look at all these people. I couldn't get any hospital to come up, but here's a clinic. Obviously, this data is only as good as, the record keeping. And then I went and looked at like supermarkets, because access to fresh, healthy food. And interestingly enough, there's like a Walmart that's we're asking it to do a lot of work here. This one Walmart, there's a other little market here, a little bodega. And then how about banks, right? You need access to your funds. Well, there's one. I mean, in this community, there's just not a lot of those resources that a lot of us take for granted. There's one here, there's one here. But interestingly enough, there's a lot, and this happens all over. There's a lot of places of worship around. So you can tell a lot by these communities, and you can also like zoom to a layer. But a good thing too is look at the density of the transportation options here too. So that's a win. That's a big win. In places like LA that really have invested in their I want to close this, in their infrastructure, their transportation infrastructure. So that is it. Let me put my slide back up so I can take some questions. We're not doing that again. So,
okay.
Any questions, any comments? Oh, I just wanted to really quickly about why I wrote the book, because I'm not a geospatial person. That is why I wrote the book, because I had all these big questions that I had to figure out. I was a data scientist, so I did have a little bit of that muscle to flex to figure it out, but I didn't want to learn. I knew Python, but I didn't want to have to learn the whole thing as deep as you'd have to go. I wanted just enough to be able to use tools, answer questions, get comfortable finding the data and working with it. So that's all I have to say about that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bonnie. Very interesting thing that you covered there about the history. Certainly, I learned some things I didn't know about the history of LA County.
Go see that palm tree, Stephen.
I'm gonna have to go see the palm tree, and obviously some interesting data sources. So we do have a number of questions. I'll just start throwing at you. There were a couple of people who were asking about where you obtain your data for redlining and for census demographics. I know you showed the open data portal, and we put some links in the chat to the different data portals LA County has as well. But do you have any tips just in general on where you're looking for data when you do these kinds of projects?
Yeah, Census Reporter is huge. I should normally like I spend time with the tools, and I'm sorry that we just kind of like blew over, but I knew a smart crowd will ask the smart questions. Census Reporter, and it's very easy to use. I actually spent a lot of time in the book, and you don't need to buy the book to see it. If you go to GitHub and look for this, the notebook that drove the analytics in the book is there. So you can see how I used the resources, because at first I used a Python package that somehow broke and I didn't have time to fix it because it was between like my first and second final edit. So I just decided to go OG, and I went right to the census and figured out how to make it easier for you to use. So there is step by step there. I did it again with SQL, which is a whole different thing, a way of addressing it. But Census Reporter packages it a little nicer for you. You do need some help when figuring out like the numbers of the tables. So I spend some time teaching you how they're numbered, how to find that data you want if you just want to look at, if you're looking at economic information, if you're looking at demographic, if you're looking, because you know the census has just grown and it's a huge resource. Also, IPUMS, IPUMS, they have inexhaustible data supplies. The reason I kind of put Census Reporter at the top is if I don't know the level of analytical skills, or if you have a like Python in your back pocket, it can be a little problematic. Census Reporter is a little more analytic friendly. The redlining data, I know they have it. Esri has a bit of it. You can, if you Google it, I will send out, actually, I'll put a post on Twitter where I'll share the link to that tool that I was using, because it is mind-numbingly interesting to look at, you know, what these manuals look like, what the underwriting manual that you would take to you know, to a property, and how you would write up like, oh, I went here, there were 3 Negroes, this is now going to be a I'm going to yellow line this area. I mean, this is the language they were using from the government in evaluating these neighborhoods. Also, OpenStreetMap, which I showed you how to get it, put the plugin into QGIS. I do all open source, so I can't really help. But Esri has everything else sorted too. They have all these libraries. The Living Atlas, by the way, if you don't have access to Esri, but you like the resources, the Living Atlas is free. A good thing about Esri is they do have a lot of things that you can get to through the Python API that you can access and use those free resources. Because I am a Mac operation, I will not use anything Windows. So I have all these workarounds that I actually put in the books, because especially if you've tried to do SQL with QGIS or Postgres, you know that it's not just simple as it is for Windows people to hit a button and import. You have to kind of go around it and figure it out. GeoFabrik, GeoFabrik, is a big global resource. I'm working on a big study for Puerto Rico and another for Brazil. So they have a lot of this data that's just bundled. And if you get an area in Brazil, in Brazil, for example, for deforestation that you're interested in, you can download it, and the files, if you use their PBF files, they're like multi-polygonal, will be in one folder, and everything that's a polygon is in a folder. Then multi-line, that's in a folder. And then you can just pull it all into QGIS or your weapon of choice and start asking these bigger questions. I think this is the data that I used in both of the books. This second one, the sequel one's not out yet, but the Python one, that's the data. And like I'm saying, it's great if you buy the book or if you win the book, but if you go to GitHub, there's also these notebooks that I'm building out there that you can actually run some of the data, and you'll see some of the data sources. And I think they're also listed in the GitHub as well.
Great. Another question, I'm sort of bundling a few, but from Tim Nolan, how do you convince your customers or clients or whoever you're working with to go deeper? You might get a simple request. How do you suggest that there's more to the story?
I was very, very persistent. Like, it's just something you have to stick with, because somebody told me after I spoke, I think it was in Charlotte, they were saying like, Bonnie, you're like an orchestra conductor. Not only are you telling everyone like, where to come in with their instrument, but then you're teaching the guy in the back how to play the oboe. I thought that was kind of funny. We just have to tell better and bigger stories. And when you see an audience live and you can zero down on a pain point that they're having, and you have to get it to that point where you could write a policy or pass a law or intervene. If in your mind you think that brown marginalized communities are living there because they're brown, well, there's nothing you can do, right? You can't unbrown them. But what you can do is start looking at the built infrastructure and look at the persistent barriers and try to address those. And does that make sense, Tim?
Well, he can't talk, but I think it makes sense on Tim's behalf.
We're friends. I can feel he's a
Yeah.
Gubby down in Texas, so
Yes,
I feel
we know
his
Tim well. He can follow up with you.
And actually, wait a minute, he's acknowledged in the acknowledgement section of the book.
All right. Congratulations, Tim. We have time for maybe one or two other questions. One from Cindy. She's curious, who requests this type of work and how can somebody get involved in this kind of work?
Well, it's funny who requests it, and then I'll answer the second part. Who requests it? Like, I have these big hospital systems that will ask me to talk. We'll do like 4-hour workshops and all this stuff, and then whenever they want to bring in the medical education, the CME person, then I know it's doomed, because if it won't fit in a pre and post little question that they can ask their medical communities, they don't do it. But they listen to it, but then they become hamstrung. They don't know what to do with the information. So it's about telling stories. And this is kind of what I tell people. You just have to be persistent, and you cannot be distracted by the low-hanging fruit of some of the ideology we tell ourselves about, like why our communities aren't thriving. I was part of a lack of a better word, it was not a commission, but it was a group, and we were trying to figure out why there were so many gunshot deaths in this community I live based on population. It was pretty disturbing. And I was pulling all the police data in, and I'm looking at it and trying to figure things out. And then you find out that, well, the reason you don't know the actual numbers until the case is solved, it doesn't show up in the, on the spreadsheet. And then it's like, well, what jurisdiction are they in? It really is such a hot mess. Sometimes you just can't even get to the data to tell the types of stories that are needed when we're talking about criminal justice. And I asked a question. I said, well, you have the data on the body you found laying in the street, but somebody shot him. Where's the data on that guy? That's the guy that I want to figure out what went wrong, So sometimes it's just about re-educating and getting more people that look like us to tell these stories. It's just data science. It's nothing I invented. This is just information laying around for anyone that's interested to go and explore. So Cindy, reach out to me on social media, and I can kind of tell you a little bit about the story of how I work and how I do what I do and how I keep the lights on, kind of thing.
All right. Well, Bonnie, we are out of time. In fact, we're a little over, but I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us and speak to our audience. You have about 250 plus people, 260 people here listening. So I'm sure there's lots of other questions. We will try to capture Bonnie's other answers, and if she's able to answer the questions we didn't get to in writing, and then we'll post those online along with the videos and stuff in a few weeks. But once again, thank you, Bonnie, for joining us, and congratulations on the book. And with that, we will take a short break and return here at the top of the hour in about 3 minutes. So we'll see you then.